Okay, so just bringing ourselves here, thanks, Spirit, and we'll just call to those ancestors and those energies of the lands that we find ourselves on, just honoring them. May our voices be a voice for you if it's appropriate, if it's safe. Well, welcome everyone to the Living Magic Occult Cast. My name's Fola, and today we have episode 8 rolling, and I have the lovely Ash Kilback. Ooh, poet, spoken word, artist, activist. Those are the things I want to say. Facilitator, just really like a really powerful wordsmith and medicine woman. So thank you, Ash, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I know that you and I were just having a short moment of connection, reminiscing from when we had a brief meeting at Wild Roses this past summer, which is quite a powerful, powerful, I don't even know, profound, if that's the way to describe it, women's gathering that we were both at. And you came to my spoken word set that I had there, and that's how we initially had got connected, just seeing each other in the crowd, and now here we are.
Yeah, so thank you so much for saying yes. Like I remember that Friday, I believe it was the Friday evening at that like kind of opening gathering. I'm like, I need to talk to her again. Like, is she gonna be here the whole time? Just everything about what you shared, like not just the words, but like the energy that you held. And the thing that really stood out to me, and I'd love to hear more your thoughts about it, was like the intimacy of
Mm.
like that particular moment, you know. So this was like it was maybe what a few hour like sort of like event that evening, lots of music and people like kind of meeting. I think people were, you know, probably feeling a bit like, okay, I'm finally in this place I can relax my body
Mm.
and enjoy like woman sisterhood. And at the end when you came on to like share, there was just like this handful of us that like I how can I describe it? It felt like it's like, oh, like we know there's something here. Like what is this gonna be? Like we need to just stay here this extra moment. Like what is that like for you? Like that level of intimacy, I guess, in your life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, say like, it was really interesting to see how the energies of the day had changed. So I initially decided to fly to the festival, and then there was lots of strikes happening during that time with WestJet. And I was like, I don't want to be in the presence of that energy as I'm getting ready to come and perform. So I'm going to drive myself. It allowed me to have a lot of time in my car just to like voice note things, to rehearse. So I had this whole kind of spaciousness open that I didn't necessarily plan before. And so it was really interesting because there was such a kind of a chaotic energy actually leading up to it, because it was such a long drive. Like I think it had taken me 10 hours to get from Saskatchewan to the festival. I didn't arrive to my Airbnb until like 1 o'clock in the morning. And for me, like that's not something that I would do the day before I'm performing, right? Like I'm in bed early, I'm making sure that I'm getting my rest. And I was also heavy bleeding. And so I woke up that day, and thankfully I had the whole day. I didn't perform till later in the evening, right? And so I was really in this like very like tender cocoon that day. And just trusting that, okay, whatever I'm gonna walk into, like, is just how it's kind of supposed to be, right? And so it was really interesting how the energy had really shifted, because I get to the festival, we had kind of the VIP gathering, and I'm talking to a few women, and they're like, well, everybody's here on Friday night. This is where like all the energy comes to the first night, and usually everybody's gathering, and it's going to be this big crowd of people. And in my body, I was like, I don't want that. There was this part of me where I was like, I don't know if I have the capacity in my being right now to match that level of energy. And sometimes, like, what we'll see often with spoken word is that there is such a commanding energy to that performance. You know, when you watch it, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of power, um, there's a lot of force that comes through that kind of performance, right? And I really had this moment before I like was performing that night. Like I went into that little treat area after the VIP area. So there was this kind of little pocket of trees where all these beautiful poplars were. And there was really nobody there. And so I just started dancing and I just got it like started getting into my body and just like connecting and grounding to the earth and kind of really bringing that energy of the land like into my body so that I could prepare for whatever energy I was going to step into, right? And so it was so beautiful because, you know, I kind of had this like rushing anxiety happening of like, you know, what if this crowd's going to be huge and I can't match the energy of it? And then, as you said, like it ended up being this like beautiful, intimate experience. And like as soon as I just like saw and felt that it was going to be that, like my entire body just totally relaxed into what that experience was going to be, right? And you know, there's something to be said about intimacy, like in the spaces of, I mean, I think anywhere, right? But I think if we're speaking to specifically that experience, it's like it allowed me to draw everybody closer, right? And there's a deeper level of connection that happens when you have that like intimate crowd, right? And you're able to match each other's energy in a different way
Mm-hmm.
as, you know, if there was going to be a larger crowd, it's kind of a different kind of energy, right? And so that whole experience, like this, that whole performance, it was the first time I'd ever done a full hour set. And I was really nervous about it. I was like, how am I going to fill this time? You know, can I do this? Right. And the whole process leading up from like canceling my flights to driving to all of that was just like giving me this spaciousness to really like sit into that space of trust and say that this is beyond you, really. You know, yes, you are the vessel that's going to be, you know, bringing this art, right? And you're going to be holding the space on the stage. But really, you know, when we get into that space of performance and whatever that might look like, right? However ways that we channel our own gifts, right? Is that we step into that space that's beyond us, right? And it takes us some resistance to like, and just like we have to kind of keep hitting those edges, right?
Yep.
Until we soften and then, you know, we just let the universe do the work in the sense that it's like the energy that needed to happen happened. And then this experience that was meant to be had when I just let it all go and say, okay, I'm letting go of what I thought I had to be or who I thought I had to be when I showed up to this festival and how I needed to perform and tapping into that like softer, gentler power. And like and knowing that that is just that's just as beautiful and just letting that take lead. And I think that's really what came out in that performance. And it was really just sitting back, trusting, and letting that intimacy of that night just create the experience for all of us.
Yeah, I love that because that, like, to you, that's nature. Like that is like the mother energy holding. Like it felt like we were being held. Especially like I think it was at the end you had us do that like gazing, right? And like something like that. Oh, like it's not easy for people. So to be in it, finding oneself in like a container where it's, you know, it kind of like goes back to our roots, I want to say. Like, don't they? I think they say historically, like we're as humans used to being in villages of only like 100 people. And like anything more than that, I think that's where we're having a lot of the challenges with like our mental health or just overall the nervous system dysregulation is because there's
Yeah.
so many people that we just can't like keep up with that. So to be able to sit with another person like a stranger and gaze into their eyes and hear what was coming through like and just let it like hold us as women, like that was so it was a really profound way to start off that whole weekend for me.
Yeah. And I had no idea like how that was gonna flow, right? Like, there were certain things like I think, in this moment, I'm like, how was I actually planning to end that? I'm not entirely sure.
Just
And if that
trusted.
kind of just came to me, because that was kind of that was really like the invitation of that poem, right? The
Mhm.
remedy for suffering. So maybe we'll bring that back after we're at the end, and I can kind
Mhm.
of begin to bring us back into that space. Um, but there is such a dissolution of all of our walls. I think our projections, our judgments, right? Because I think it's so easy to be out in the world, in the world in which we're living now, where we are very disconnected, right? Where doing something like that and just sitting in front of somebody and looking them in the eyes is a really terrifying thing. It's really uncomfortable for a lot of people, right? So many people aren't experiencing that kind of intimacy in their days, right? But it's just this simple invitation of, and I've witnessed this in myself, like having experiences like that before in women's gatherings, and just like how it does not take long for love to be present when we look into the eyes of somebody else without saying anything, without just like holding that presence, is that there's something at work that then peels away everything else that we have brought with us that separates us from that person and
Mhm.
ourselves, and the way that we are really just mirrors for each other. We are each other, right? And that practice is so powerful for really showing people that, right? And it brings up a lot, but I think it's really like it's reconnecting people back to love.
Yeah, yeah, I guess that's exactly what it is. Like, well, and I'm curious because we were just talking about this the other week. I was in like the choir practice, and one of our warm-ups, he was like, "Okay, go around and do this vocal warm-up, and while you're walking around this room with like maybe 70, 80 people are in the choir, like make eye contact with someone and just simply like nod."
Mm.
And I noticed like very few people, very majority of people were just like down, like eye gaze down. They maybe look a little like for a brief moment, except when it came to walking around. This was like maybe a couple minutes of an exercise. So when you walked by someone maybe two, three times, then they seemed to like gaze just a little bit more. But I had such gratitude for my experiences, same like in women's circles and some of the like kind of different experiences I've had where eye gazing is actually like a part of the practice. And can be a bit scary at times, but like open. It's like it opened something for me that I could even walk around and almost was like longing for like eye contact. Like, come on, it's safe. Like, like it's good. Like, but recognizing where people are at. But I guess I'm curious for yourself, like, were you always open to this level of intimacy, or like what did that journey look like for you, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, of course. No, I've always been very high functioning, very high energy, with a lot of anxiety. And so I used to be somebody with, I mean, of course, my nervous system still goes through periods and experiences of dysregulation, right? But I think that, I think it really goes back to my childhood of being an incredibly sensitive child, right? Feeling everything, thinking so deeply about just the world and just like the way that I would absorb things. Right? I'm a projector in human design. So I have just like I am casting out this like wide net of energy all of the time. And I'm observing the inner workings of what's going on around me in the world all the time. And then I'm mirroring what's happening inside my body. And so there's such a large level of stimulation that I'm receiving all of the time. And I think as I've gotten older to kind of understand that language, right? But a lot of that, a lot of that I didn't understand what that meant when I was young, right? And a lot of the stories and a lot of the ways that people would receive me is that, well, like I'm too much, right? Like I was so hyper, and there was a part of me that was just like really longing for that attention, right? And I was always trying to just like grasp for that attention. I'm the oldest of three, and so I think that I just like I always wanted that attention on me. But it was from such a like a dysregulated space, right? And so like I just had this like I was just this little like firework of energy all of the time that was just like erupting and like feeling all of these things, right? But so much of that was denied, so I wasn't really allowed to give myself permission to really, express my energy freely in that way, right? But I also had no practices for grounding it. Still to this day, I haven't really talked about this publicly a lot, but I have this like kind of interesting quirk where like my body shakes, and it's literally like my body has to become like a grounding rod for energy. So like I'll feel like this like energy or this joy, or I'll just feel like this like massive surge of energy that'll just like come through my body, and I shake. And I did that even when I was a child, right? And it's something that, I always got made fun of for. But it was like this, it was this pulling in of this energy, right? And so I I never really understood why my body would constrict in that way, why I would have to like just ground myself into whatever energy I was experiencing that was happening around me, right? And so, I lived most of my like young adult life like that, right? Of just not really understanding like, turning that story of I'm so highly sensitive. I'm feeling so many things. There must be something wrong with me. And so I carried that story with me for a really long time and just misunderstood my own sensitivities, right? And just didn't really know how to bring them home, didn't really know how to honor that, and just fully accept that that's truly just who I am, right? And so I would say nature has had such a like profound role in my own grounding practice over the last few years. And so it did take me to have I had a nervous breakdown in the spring of 2019. And that was really like it was it felt like all of my life coming to that moment of just like how long I had really just like ignored myself, how dysregulated, how wound up I was because I just didn't know what to do with this energy that I had. Right. And so I think coming into that kind of experience where my nervous system was literally like out, like just inside up, inside out, upside down, all the things, right? To then being able to have this massive clearing of energy and healing that allowed me to actually come back into or to learn about what it means to be grounded, to really understand my energy, to give it permission to be like intimate with it in a way that's loving, and then to know what I need to do to ground it so that it can be channeled in a different way, right? Where it's not sporadic and it's not chaotic and it's all over the place. So I think that's like how you might have experienced me years ago, right? It's like I have this like really like, and it's still there, right? But it's like it was such a bursting firework of energy where now I've had the practices and just the relationship with myself to now just be like I know how to ground it and direct it and yeah.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for sharing that. Because even like the way you describe that, like rod, I'm like seeing you as kind of as like this tree. Like, isn't that kind of what like a tree is or does? It's just like a pole rooted deep in the earth, like reaching up high still, like, and almost like a conduit. And like how sometimes you get like the leaf shake or like do you know what I mean? Like in the like wind
Totally.
or like the vibration, and
Yeah.
yet how just like grounding it is for us.
And the
You,
trunk stays, right? Like when
mhm,
we watch a tree, right? And I think that's like how I think we can see all of ourselves that way, right? It's like all of these winds of energy that are in our lives, right? And I think that it's how we find those practices to stay rooted. There are days out here where we've had wild, like 70, 80 kilometer winds, right? And I've just watched the trees, like, and I've just seen this sturdiness, right? Where it's like their trunks are like bending and like, dancing, but there's just like, but they still remain, right? And it's like, how do we, how do we practice becoming that,
Ooh,
right?
yeah, that's a great
How do
question.
we how do we let the fullness of energy be present, but also just like stay in that groundedness, right? So that like when the wind's coming, we're like, okay, we can let ourselves dance with it, right? But we have this like center of self. And I think that's so much of what comes back to how do we regulate our beings so we can stay in that center because life's gonna, that wind is gonna move us and shake us.
Yeah, well, that's often what I'll say. It's like a breakdown is usually the breakthrough, like, because it leads to the skills that we can develop, the understanding and insights necessary to like make us more who we are, and like there's nothing wrong with that. It's like it's part of the life experience. It's like that shadow side that really I think is the place that like brings a deeper meaning even to like this life, to our story. It leads to so much like inspiration even within like the creative like realm, art, music, poet, whatever it might be. But I guess for yourself, because like my understanding from what I've read a little bit is like you maybe worked in kind of like the corporate world or some other world, and then perhaps the events that took place and now where you've been with this. Like, do you mind sharing a bit about like the old Ash, like what the skills
Yeah.
or ways were that you used, and then now, like what are those ones that you really hone in on to support you in balancing?
Yeah. Um, so I think a lot of my earlier journeys, so I grew up with my parents were self-made entrepreneurs. So that was the world that I grew up in. I saw my parents, building businesses from the ground up, doing one thing to the next, chasing the dream, working day in, working constantly, really, right? And so I think a lot of my identity was really shaped around like that's who I thought I had to be in the world, right? Is the way that the mirror the way that we grew up, right? And so I went to business school and I got a degree in marketing. And I was on that path. Like I was on that path of just like, I think I'll probably start out like, doing the 9 to 5 thing. And I was just on the path of my peers. We were all kind of in this place of what it means to be in the business world. And, I think there's kind of two sides to this story where, I always knew that I was creative, but I had a really hard time harnessing like, where did I really want to go with that? And I think that's part of our journeys, right? I think that's a lot of who we are. I don't want to say this is necessarily in our 20s because I think this can happen in any decade, but where there's this like experimentation of self, right? We're just trying to like see where like, where can I put something out and where does it really resonate with me? Where does it sing back to me? Right? And so while I was in business school, I also really loved fashion. And so there was a part of me that had always dreamed of like writing for a fashion magazine. So like this desire to write was always very alive in me. And so halfway through business school, I was like, there's this creative part of me that's not being nurtured right now. I'm going to these accounting classes and, I'm talking about business management and all these things, but it's just like there's something here where I'm like, I don't fit though. And so there's something else that I need to kind of explore while I'm here. And so I actually started writing a fashion blog and I was kind of, doing doing the, I guess how would I describe it? Um just writing about like outfits that I was wearing, kind of telling like funny stories about things. So I started to tell stories, right? And then there was a point in time where I was like, there's something more here though. I don't want to be out and, taking these photos of myself. And there's something that's lacking substance that I need to kind of see how I can take this deeper. And so I started this interview series called Up Close and Personal, and I started interviewing people in the fashion industry about why they were doing what they were doing, right? What was the core essence of their creativity and what did it mean for them to create, right? And so this really kind of started this desire for story. And I think understanding the power of story and how story connects us. And so that was kind of the first iteration. And then, as I had come out of school and I was really struggling to find out where did I fit. Like I was kind of bouncing around and doing some freelance work. So I'd kind of started doing some copy editing. I was helping people with their website. I was doing some kind of like communications work for different agencies. And I was just kind of floating around and not really grounding anywhere. And just not really feeling like I could be in a space where I really wanted to fully show up for what I was doing. And so I'd spend a lot of time in the community, like going to different networking events. And, that's something that you did a lot when you were in the business faculty, right? You were always at different events and you were always wanting to make connections and meet people. And, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about when we're in these spaces together, right? There is this I think one of the things of what it is that a lot of people who organize things don't really think about the energetics of space, right? Of how do we create a space that allows for people to feel safe, to feel like they can be themselves, to maybe share more vulnerably. And so I feel like I was having a lot of these conversations where I was like, there's so much more to, I think, what people want to share, but there isn't this safety or there isn't this opportunity where they feel like they can. And so at the time, I was listening to the Moth radio. So the Moth is a really well-known nonprofit in this storytelling nonprofit in the States. So they do like story slams where people come and share stories about their lives just based on different topics and things like that. And I was like, that's really cool. I really love the way that it just creates this like it just bridges our humanness together. And so I started a storytelling show series that I did for 4 years. And so it really started out in the business space. The first few shows were actually about entrepreneurship and, people reflecting on their careers and things like that. But the more that I got into that experience, I realized that it was so much more than that. And so it became about, mental health and love and addiction. And just like people just talking about like their own dark nights of the soul in a way, right? And how they got through it on the other side. And so it was a show that was in this small coffee shop that was free, and then it ended up growing to a show that was in a local venue and over 100 people would come to it. And so it was this it was like that thread of story that I followed from kind of that very first like inkling, right? That really came into creating this experience where like the way that I talk about it is like, you'd be in this room full of people and somebody would be sharing this story and I was always behind the stage, so I'd always like peek and I'd always like watch the crowd and you would just see these like invisible bridges being created, right? People were like laughing, people were crying, people were completely silent and present in ways that we aren't, right? And so it really created this space for connection to come through in such an authentic way. And I think that's what story does, right? That's just what story offers for us. It's like this drawbridge that when we share something about our lives that we've lived through, it opens us to whoever is listening. And it creates these bridges of connection that are so powerful. Um, and I think that's really where it was just it was started bringing me back home to my own story in a way. It was like I was working with other people and their own stories. And I was witnessing about the power of what happened when people had the opportunity to share their story. Something that they might have not have told their closest family or friends around the dinner table, but then they were coming to a room of strangers and they were sharing it. And what that was doing for people, right? This desire to be seen and heard. And when we go back to that eye gazing thing, that's exactly what it is, right? Um, And so that just opened something entirely up in me, um, that I like still to this day, even though I'm not in that space doing that work right now. Um, it really it really opened that space for me to step into my own story, my own voice, um, and who I am as like a poet and a performer. And just my love for really being in the stage and being able to create those kind of intimate experiences of connection is really so what I live for.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so beautiful. Like to be able, like you said, to create the safe space for people then to be open and vulnerable in front of strangers. Like I feel like we're living in a world right now that it's kind of like this precipice of, okay, where we could either be super vulnerable and kind of put ourselves at like risk is how it can sometimes
Mhm.
feel. Will people
Mhm.
receive what I
Absolutely.
have to say? There's the whole cancel culture, like all this stuff that I think is almost like these like adversaries to test us as if we are actually going to open up, and then
Mhm.
how to do so in a way that can be heard or received, especially in like the light of like technology nowadays, which I wonder, like being how you came from like a world of like marketing, and like you see the benefit of technology, online spaces. I know you use social media in the various forms that you do, but like what are your thoughts on that? Like how will that shift? Like what maybe is necessary for humanity to maintain its like realness and
Mhm.
vulnerability, especially when it comes to sharing like their stories or truths?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel like that's such a big, big question to kind of think
Sorry.
through, right? No, it's okay. I love it though. Um, because I think that yeah, let me just sit with like, I think it comes back to, all of like with technology is like I think we have so many things in the world right now that work against us that keep us separated, right? And I think that I think that there's so much noise and that there's so much distraction um coming from so many different places, right? Whether that's social media, whether that's the media itself, right? Is that like I think that when we talk about even like the heart of storytelling is like there's this simplicity that I think that we have to come back to, right? Is that, we're living in this world where we're so highly overstimulated, right? And we don't know how to like regulate ourselves back into that space of being able to, be open for that kind of connection, right? And I think it's like we're all flocking to these spaces for like the same thing, but I think that we're starting to realize that it's not, it's not ever going to give us that real, true, authentic experience of really physically being together. And I think that's really what it is that I'm coming back to, right? Because, when we talk about like, if we even take this back to like, ancestral days, right? It's like storytelling existed in that form around the campfire for a reason, right? There was a lot of ritual and there was a lot of way that culture was kept alive through the art of storytelling, right? We've seen this in very sacred ways from indigenous cultures and many other cultures around the world, right? Is that storytelling takes such a sacred place in culture. Um, but it also has such a sacred place in connection. And I think it's realizing that, like, us being together, and I think we really realized that we saw what we that did to the psyche of humanity. We saw what it did to the nervous systems of humanity when we went into isolation, right? When the world shut down and we went away from each other. And I think that we're still trying to figure out how we get back there. Because I think since that moment in time, there has kind of been this like undercurrent of narrative that wants us to stay that way, right? Wants us to stay divided, wants us to stay on this side and this side, right? And so, it's how do we, and I like, and this is a question that I don't necessarily have answers to, and that like I think it's simply just like coming together just for the sake of, being together and just sharing like authentically like who we are and what it is that we've lived through, right? Without any kind of agenda, or if it's just coming back to that kind of um I think the heart of what our stories are, right? And trying to find like trying to continually seek out those spaces where we can just be together in a way that allows us to just be fully human again, right? And just to come back into that remembrance, I think of really what it is that it's like, and we all know this. We all know this when we shut all of that out and we enter into an experience where we're not on our phones and we're just with each other, right? Whether that's just like sitting in a living room with our friends,
Hmm.
right? Or we're out walking with somebody, right? It's like that moment that we just like take away all of the noise of the world and we come together and we just sit in that space of just like remember what it is just to be human and what it is that we live through. And that we all see each other in that space, no matter how different we are, right? And I think it's such a simple truth. Um, and that's like, how do we find our way back to that? I think it's just the question that I ask because it just feels like things are so divisive right now. Things are very complex, things are very nuanced. But it's just like there's a simplicity, um, you know, love can be simple, connection can be simple. And it's just how do we get to those places to remember that? Because that's really where the power of, I think that's where so much healing lies, right?
Yeah, well, because
That
the
makes sense.
body, it regulates. You mentioned it right off the bat, like when you talked about the sensitivities is like a youth and how you would mirror the things. Like, so if we can now instill like a different way of being, then we're gonna start mirroring each other in a different way, in a more relaxed way, um, more present way. And yeah, I think it can be hard. Like, I feel we get caught up in as the week goes by. There's only 7 days in a week. Like life is happening, and if like I have a daughter, and usually on Sundays, like our morning time, and the weeks she's with me, it's like Sunday morning is our like no tech day, and I find it a challenge even to not like look at the phone or want to check an email. And yet, like yesterday, it was a reminder of just how potent it can be just when we've like dedicated, okay, we're just gonna to not look at any screens and just be in like the space, whether we're together or, and it was really beautiful because like what I find too, and maybe you want to share about that, is like how the creative potential comes through when there's that space, because then she started working on, she's quite the artist herself, I would say, like working on with her 3D pen, like she got this printing pen, which is still technology, the irony there. But like, and it's just like because she allowed the space away from distraction of her tablet, and then we were able to have these like this heart to heart connection too. Like it was just, yeah, it was very beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, there's this whole like adjacent conversation that it's like, that is really so much of like the my own path that I'm walking now, right? And so there's something to be said about like, I think realizing like the places that we're running from externally to find that feeling of connection, right? To find like that feeling of being seen and heard. And, it's like that's never going to be filled externally. Right. And so I think it's, realizing how asking ourselves of how do we come home, I think before we ask how do we come home to each other, we have to know how we come home to ourselves. Right. And so a really overarching theme in my life now, and I think this is even like, another layer of this conversation that we're having about disconnection is that, well, we're disconnected from the earth. We're not even in connection with nature, the natural rhythms of the world, right? This wisdom, the beauty, the fact that we're alive on this like spinning rock in space kind of a thing, right? It's like we're not even attuned to the energies um, of this beautiful place that keeps us alive, right? And so, you know, over the last, and this actually did start during the pandemic for me, was like I just started getting outside more. Because there's a spaciousness that opened in our lives in a different way. And so I was living outside of the city at the time as well. And I, just as an opportunity to take a break from staring at the computer because I was working from home, I just wanted to get outside, right? And then slowly over time, I started this mindful walking practice where, and like my rule always still to this day is like I don't go out with headphones. I've got my phone on me for safety because I'm walking out in the bushes right now. Right, I'm out far in nature, so I kind of just need to have that for safety purposes, or if you're in the city as well, right? Um, but what started happening was it was a simple practice of walking, where I was walking out in the world and I was paying attention in a way that I had never paid attention before. Because we always, we're in this state of consumption, right? That speaks to the technology, right? Where we feel that to receive this connection and this inspiration and there's something to be said, yes, that when we're in the state of consuming, we can still feel those things, right? But we're so used to filling our beings with as much as we possibly can that we are afraid to feel what it's like to empty it into the space of receiving, right? And then that's when so what happens when we get into this experience is what started to happen as I started to walk and I started to really understand what I was doing is that when I was out in the world and I was paying attention and I was this like open vessel for it, is that my consciousness started shifting because I was now in this state of awareness that I was never operating in before when I would be, going out for a walk and I would just be paying attention to the world, right? Whether it's watching the wind or it's watching the birds or it's just like standing and feeling the sun for a moment, right? And just letting my thoughts and my being do what it needs to do, right? Of course, I'll go for walks where I'm like, oh, I really didn't pay attention to the scenery today because I was lost somewhere else. And sometimes when we're lost, that's, what we need to do is we need to get in the body and we need to go and we need to unravel that train of thought so that by the time that we end, we've emptied, then we're kind of in this space, right? And so like getting out into the world. And so this is how it translates back into and I think this is really coming back to maybe what I really wanted to say in that initial question of like, when we practice the space of openness within ourselves, right? The way that I've been walking out in the world. And I've just been like, I am so often like just so rocked by the beauty of everything, the beauty and the impermanence and just like all of this wisdom and this that's available to us here, right? And what the world has to teach us when we're paying attention. Right. And when we shift our attention in that way, and then we carry it out into the world, and I think that's like where, people in my own life have been like your energy has shifted so massively in the last few years. And I was like, yeah, because I've just been paying attention And so when I'm like in the presence of other people, I have this like spaciousness that I then can come tap into, this sense of openness and presence that creates this intimacy, that creates this softness, right? So I was in Saskatoon a couple months ago, and I was just out walking like I do, and with nothing, right? And it's always interesting to bring this practice back into a city when I'm usually always by myself, right? Um, but this is how it changes how we show up in the world. When we do the work of being present in the world and emptying ourselves and receiving this wisdom and grounding our energy into the earth. And then when we show up into these like, the cities or like our relationships or this very chaotic energy, we're able to hold this kind of openness that brings people back to that. So like I go for this walk and it was just there was some kind of interesting magic happening that day because I was like going for a walk and every single person that I saw, I like we had this moment where we looked at each other and they would say hello or they would smile because they knew that I was open. I didn't have my headphones in. I wasn't blocked. I wasn't in this other space of time where I'm like, I'm not present here. I'm not paying attention to anything. But the world and like people around us will experience that. We're like, oh, this woman is just walking and she's looking at me. And people would say like, hi, like, how's your day? Or people would just like smile and nod at me, right? And so there was like these like connections that were happening. Um, because I'm just opening myself to allow for people. And I could just feel that sense of like being out in the world and people being like, "Oh, I'm feeling seen in this moment. Somebody's actually looking at me for a moment. Somebody's smiling. Somebody's like making a comment about the weather or whatever that is, right?" And so it's like there's such a transformative power in the practice of walking, and it seems like such a small thing. But what I've witnessed of how that has like shifted my consciousness of my own relationship to the earth, creativity, spirituality, but then how I bring that back into being with people,
Mhm.
um, and carrying that kind of openness that, has created really, really beautiful experiences in my life.
Yeah, wow. No, it's amazing to recognize even like it is truly such a simple act walking. I think something too that we can take for granted, like living in a particular area. And I think it's Julia Cameron, right? Like the artist's way, like that. I'm not sure if it's in the artist's way or if it's in that walking in the world. Like that's one of her like recommended techniques is like every day walking and
Yeah.
without distraction, like just like I love like the words echoing in my mind is just like that word you use, the emptying. Like that is what it is. Like it really is like in the earth just I feel like the earth just wants to take like that like the perfect mother that just wants to hold perfect in her imperfections or just way of existing, wants to hold that for us if we can just spend that moment like communing with her, being present with her, not and it's not a judgment because like I like doing all sorts of things in nature. It's like oftentimes when I go for a walk, I'll notice like people are in like a rushness or they're like there's like an action that's taking place while in it instead of that presence. And I still think there's benefit though to whatever people are doing is like however they might be enjoying being in the space. It's like maybe a bit of an experiment for people listening. Like, how can you approach it in a new way? Like, what does she want to share with you? How does she want you to engage? And what feels like a yes for them to build that relationship? Yeah,
Yeah, like
yeah.
even like the day to day, right? It's like I think nature offers us that spaciousness that we need,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we're so full. And I think that's the thing. It's like we're so dysregulated and we're so overstimulated that it's like, how do we find this inner authority, right? How are we able to create that kind of spaciousness in which connection comes through, in which love comes through, in which acceptance comes through, right? All of these things that bring us back to that core essence of being human and that togetherness that we so need, right? And so, you know, it is practices like taking it, like going somewhere that allows that really true emptying away from everybody, right? But I think it's like, how do we also bring that practice in the day to day, right? Where like even when we're sitting in our cars, right? It's like I drive slower now. Like I haven't got a ticket. I like to talk about nervous system regulation. I used to have so many speeding tickets that I had to do a dangerous driving course.
Oh, fun.
And
I
in
want to
the
picture that of you. That's funny.
But that's the rushing. That's the urgency. That's the dysregulation, right? And it's like, and of course, I still get like, we're human. We're gonna get caught up in that all the time, right? But there's such a consciousness that I'm operating from there where I'm like, I'm driving slower. Like I haven't had a ticket in like 6 years now, right? And it's like small things like that when it's like driving in your car and like, really paying attention to what's like happening in your surroundings, right? Or it's like, you know, if you're out in a public place, right, and you're having a coffee, just like sitting and taking a moment just to pay attention to the room. What are people doing? And just like, and I think however we want to just take that moment of practice of like, let's just sit and observe for a minute. Like let's just watch the world. Let's just
Yeah.
see that, because you're going to find things that you're going to find those like moments of connection and wisdom and there's so much um that is available to us when we choose to pay attention, right? And in the simplest of ways, we just have to allow ourselves. We just have to prioritize it. We have to know that that's really what matters.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you use that word because I think initially, like that's kind of what it's had to become with my daughter, at least like to the way I perceive it is instilling a sense of importance or value to it and whatever she decides down the road. But like you mentioned right off the bat, like what we witness in our childhood oftentimes is the way in which we then approach life. And so it has become like, hey, it's like a scheduled sort of experience to the point of then, and I tell folks this, it's like if we have to put in our calendar like self-care time, like an hour every week or every day, 15 minutes, like that's okay until it becomes a practice that like, or a habit, I guess, that we just live by. And then also with that being said, I want to talk to like the honoring of the cycles that you talked about, like for our physical bodies, especially as women, that like I think many people can get hard on themselves when they don't do something regularly. And I'm like, it's okay, like be in the flow of it, like because like as much as I love to go for a walk or do certain practices, like there's periods of times where it's just it could go like a week and I'm like, oh, and I'll feel like the nudge or hear the voice being like, it's time, like it's
Mhm.
time, and then like checking the resistance of why.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm actually just really coming back into this journey of like, I feel as though I've been very present with the seasons just with where I'm living right now. But I work full time in fundraising. And so like my schedule from really like April until the end of September is very, very full. And I think just the energy of summer in itself, right? Summer is always such a short season. It's always such a chaotic energy. It's just we let the winds of summer carry us, and it just and then we just exhale when we kind of come into fall, right? And so, I really was at this um, you know, September, I was just really burnt out. Like I was just like I feel like I was just running. Like I just was, I was just in this flow of constantly doing and right. And I think that's always like what I'm trying to find this balance with of like not really, I don't love the way that the 9 to 5 structure is set up. I don't think that it's it supports our productivity. I think it's unnatural. I think it's very unnatural, right? And so I do struggle to kind of exist in that confines. But I think it's like, how do we find, and so like, I think as the seasons shifted, for me, like I love fall. It always just like brings me back home. And I think that those are a lot of things that I've just been pulling back into practice in my own life, right? Where it's just like, really knowing that the reason why I've been feeling so exhausted and that I've been experiencing such intense fatigue on my period that I literally have to spend a day in bed is because I'm not honoring the cycle, right? And just realizing that it's just like, going with the flow of that energy, right? When it's just like trusting that when we're in that state of ovulation and we're just like, we're feeling creative and we're feeling alive, um, and fully honoring that, right? But then it's being really mindful. Like, so now it's like I'm really looking at my calendar and I'm like, okay, like the week before I have my like the week, like a few days before I bleed, and then when I'm bleeding, I'm not seeing anybody. Because what was happening is that I wasn't really honoring that in my scheduling. And all of a sudden, those weeks, those days leading up to me bleeding was just like full of seeing people and connection and doing things. And I was going against the natural rhythm of like, the of our cycles, right? And so like I think that's part of like coming back into, even as like that connects back into like the rhythms of like Mother Earth, right? It's like we have to continually come back to this remembrance, like, especially for those of us that are bleeding, right? It's like we know like our body is already on that clock. And so it's natural for us to kind of tap into that, but also just like seeing how that's mirrored in the natural world, right? Like I'm looking out of the solarium right now, and it's like all of the trees are completely dead. They're bare skeletons of themselves right now. Well, we think they're dead. They're still very much living. Right? But a lot of the world dies, right? A lot of the world goes into this retreat and there's this silence and there's this emptying that happens, right? And it's like how beautiful that we actually get that opportunity every month to do that too, right? That all throughout every season we have that opportunity to listen to the body, right? To give ourselves like, where we can come into the fullness of being, right? And it's like we can fill our schedules with what we love and we can see the people that we want to see, right? But then also honoring that time, right? There was a TED talk actually that a girlfriend had just sent to me about our cycles, and she compared it to the seasons. And I loved that, where it's like, in a 28-day period, we're going through every season, right? And so it's happening very quickly in our bodies, right? But just realizing that it's like, okay, as I'm coming into bleeding, I'm now coming into winter for a week. This means that I hibernate. This means that I rest, right? And so we're all like our bodies are already really in that season, and tapping into that is also what helps us to and fill and to and to ground ourselves into that space of the presence that we all desire, right?
Yeah, and I hope that like more conversations like this will be what kind of transforms more women, especially, or those that are like bleeding to like step up and, hey, employer, like what ways can we approach this whole practice? Because yeah, like it would lead to more productivity overall, but like not just productivity, like just overall happiness, wellness for people, everyone. If we were approaching life in that way, I think of like finding the balance within our internal system and also like the ecosystem, the world around us. Um, so yeah, it's so beautiful to hear that you've been like tapping into that for yourself.
Yeah, yeah, coming back, right? Because I think just like
Hmm.
I think I've had so many experiences with my period lately that I'm just like, okay, like what needs to shift? Because I'm so exhausted to the point where it's just like I actually can't function. Like I've had to take days off of work just so that I can lay in my bed and just be in a space of complete silence because my body is so exhausted, right? And I'm like, that's not right, right? Like there's something that I'm not honoring there, and then when I take a look at my patterns and I'm saying, oh, well, I'm not even honoring the natural rhythms anymore. I've just gotten into this cycle of doing, right? And it's so hard because that's when we are when we're doing the 9 to 5 thing, right? And we live our days under certain confinements, right? Is that it's we don't always have the fullness of this, like that the fullness, right? To be able to all of the systems were created to work against our natural rhythms, right? And so how do we find kind of these pockets in time to remember that connection as we're kind of living within it, right? Because, we have to live with them. We have to live within them, right? But I think as we live within them, we have opportunities to change, right? So, I know for me, like I go for walks almost every day at lunch. And like I'm like, okay, I'm getting out on the walking path, I'm moving my body, I'm spending some time with the earth, right? And then it just gives me this presence that I then can come back into my workday in the afternoon, right? And so I've seen how that's shifted how I lead as an example of people that don't ever consider doing anything like that, right? It's like, no, I'm going to take a moment of presence here and I'm going to be in my body. Because then I know I can show up and be present for my work. I have more capacity, right? And so I think this is another thing that like I like speak to a lot as well is like, um, rest gives us capacity. We have this story in our minds that it's like, well, if we're not being productive, we're not contributing, we're not worthy, right? And I mean, that is how the system is set up to make us feel like we always have to be
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
But in the resting and the slowing, there's this widening of capacity, right? And so we allow ourselves to rest and to come back together and to empty and like to be grounded. Then we show up in our workplaces, then we show up with our friends, then we show up with our children, we show up with our partner, right? With a different kind of capacity that allows for all of those things to come back in: connection, love, right? Joy. And so it's just like that's the power of rest too, right? It's like it's so much of like we're talking about, right? Um, Recognizing I'm too full. I'm too full. I'm too overstimulated. Something needs to go. We need to rest. We need to get outside. What do we need to do?
Yeah, and I'm really enjoying how you tied in like that emptying part for the earth. I've never considered winter as being that period where it's like, well, the earth now is getting to do that, which would totally make sense considering like summertime, spring, summer, we just like we're out there as humans, like a lot. I really do enjoy it because people they go out, they enjoy their time at the parks, they're like gathering with like family and friends, having like barbecues, and it's just so like full and like it is a little bit chaotic at times, that excitement. And then she like I say she like she takes it and then like releases it for us.
Yeah.
um
Mhm.
yeah, there's something about that imagery that's just like, okay, I have a bit more grace maybe now, a little bit more compassion for the longer colder months when I wish it was warmer out.
Yeah.
um
And there's like, and that invites us into like this kind of silence, right? That it's like, when winter comes, it's this beautiful opportunity. Like I love walking in winter now.
oh
I
yeah.
think a lot of times, and of course, like it's like, like there is that, being inside and being cozy and all those things, right? But winter has its own magic. Winter is peace, winter is stillness, winter is silence, right? And like even when we talk about the air and the coldness, right? The coldness acts as a channel that clears as well, it empties. And so it's just if there's anything that I've all like learned from walking is that there's such wisdom in every season. When we're outside, there's a healing and there's a clearing and there's an emptying that happens every single time we step outside and we allow ourselves to be awake to the world. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Ooh, I like that. Okay, I'm being mindful of the time, and
Yes, I know
and I
that.
realize, as usual, the questions I've sent you, and then but we've talked about nature and a bit of
Mhm.
like your practices that like the specifics of like the animal world has not really shown up. And I really, yeah, I've enjoyed reading what you've like shared either on the Substack about the different animals, and like even your stories that you like shared during that evening at Wild Roses. Like, any words you want to share with us about the animal kingdom in particular, or like what animals really connect with you, or that you feel a bit like more of this tied to? Like, yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah. I feel like I was a bird in a past life. I love birds. I think that's something that I'm always paying attention to. I write about birds a lot as well too. I just think that there's just something that I'm so drawn to about, I don't know, their energy, flying creatures, right? Like, um, owls in particular. So owl is like one of my spirit animals for sure. It's a bird that I do see. Like I know they're very elusive creatures, but I'm always the one that spots them. Like my partner Walt and I were just driving to go to the grocery store the other night. And as we're driving up the hill, I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's a great horned owl right there. And he's like, we were like, wow. And then we were like, we wanted to get out of the car and everything. And I was like, we just have to see it like this, right? We just have to let it be. Because we always want to rush close to nature, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, owls are something that always come into my awareness. They come into my meditations all the time as well. So I think it's just like their wisdom, like the magic, right? It's like they always bring some kind of message about like really, I think, paying attention, right? And I think that's what I always look to. So like I have I think it's The Shaman's Guide to Power Animals, is one of my favorite books. And so I would say like that's something that I'm continually learning. I think there's more work that I would like to do, and like how do I even learn to connect and communicate deeper with the animal world? Because I'm always present to watching where they are. There's deer here all of the time. There's a white-tailed doe right now that has like four fawns, and you'll see them every morning at sunset and every evening at sunrise, and they feel like neighbors. You can walk pretty close to them on the road and just stand and look at them. And I think just being in the presence of wildness, like draws us back into that own remembrance of, like the magic and the beauty, the wildness of the world, right? Like there's just such wisdom, I think, in creatures that are utterly themselves. And when we see them just existing in that way, it always moves something alive within us, right? And so like I do find often that like when I see an animal, like I'll go back to that, I'll go back to my book, right? And I'm like, oh, what's this showing me? Right? And so I think that animals are always messengers. And then the way that, and maybe that message will arrive when we're out thinking about something and then we see an animal and it brings us back into this wisdom, right? But I think that I've like just by watching, like I had like an older piece that I shared that was called Patterns of Belonging, and it was just all about watching the geese fly, gather for migration and fly, right? And the way that they fly in this V, but they always take turns, right? Like the leader is always shifting. There's always room. They're always creating space for each other, right? There's this like unified energy in which like so much of the natural world exists in, right? And it's always mirroring what we are forgetting. It's like looking to the way that the birds organize themselves. This communal effort that takes place where thousands of birds are in the field as they get ready for migration. There's this togetherness, right? And then there's this pattern of belonging that they create that's like they understand the significance of each other as part of the whole. Like that's what I see with birds all the time, right? And I'm just like, they always mirror that for us of this sense of togetherness. Um, right? These are and that simply just comes with like, even that's the practice of paying attention, of not necessarily knowing, okay, what is the medicine of this particular animal? Because yes, sometimes I'm intrigued and I'll go back to my books and I'll do some studying about it. But other times it's just a matter of like paying attention of what's coming up in my own life
Hmm.
and then seeing the animals that are coming up with what's ever in my mind and whatever I'm maybe wrestling with, and just knowing that whatever I'm witnessing from that animal, um, and whatever comes to mind or whatever I receive just by watching it is the medicine.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because that's exactly it. Like even yesterday we finished our like sound journey hosting and I went to put some candles away and there was a little ladybug just and I was like, "Oh, look." Like and the ladybug's been showing up quite a bit in like some of the circles we've been like in, which is, and it amazes me. It's like, look, these little guys are just coming inside. Like what is that as we're making this transition into the colder months and yeah, I think it's so easy for humanity to just kind of like brush off any encounter with wildlife or anything. It's just but I really, really dig what you were saying about almost like our fascination though with animals, the animal world or kingdom is that like authentic expression, the wildness, just how they are. And I think that's what we innately wish to be too, without the confines of like a house or the kind of boxes that we've somehow built around ourselves. Hmm.
Yeah, and I think just like I think that's like you said, like it's like everybody feels this fascination and astonishment, right? It's like when somebody's out in the wild and they see something, whether it's like a bird or a deer or a wolf, right? It's like they're like we're captivated. We're like,
Yeah.
wow, like what a gift it is to just see this wild creature in our
Hmm.
presence. Um, and I think that's where we also have to like coming back into relationship with the seeing it as that way as well too, right? Because like I think that's part of the disconnection is we just don't think about we're forgetting how everything is a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Oh, and like, thank you for that reminder. The importance of not attempting to capture the images, like, because what I've learned with that, it's like those medicine signs of the animals showing up. It's like it really is. It's this moment, and I think back to a time I was like, just there was a ravine area near here. And I just would go for my walks, and one morning I decided to kind of just sit by like the water a little bit longer. And then I saw an owl. It was quite like early in the morning, so that like dusk kind of
Mhm.
or dusk dawn. And like it was there. This was like a good probably 10 minutes. I was just like, wow. And then all of a sudden it like took flight, but this guy had come and set up a giant camera. And like right and I was like, oh, this is what happens when we try to like capture the moment. I just find it so humorous, and it was a very magical experience for me because I feel like I don't often see the owl. And yeah, like the wisdom it holds and the connection to so many things for me. Galactic and earthly. But
Mhm.
yeah, like it's like just really inviting those personal experiences that we have with nature, with the animal kingdom, or whatever synchronicities maybe show up like as like they are sacred.
Mhm.
They're sacred and meaningful.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we might have to have you back on here if you're you're open to that because like we didn't even really get to talk about your poetry,
I know.
but
We just kind of went on our own journey, which I mean, I'm always open for how the spirit of conversation carries sometimes too, right? And I think like and I find that that's like what like kind of from what we were talking about in the very beginning, right? Of just like the letting go of how we expect something to be. And
yeah.
when we just like sit back into like you know, that space of just like, okay, just let me be the channel. Just let this conversation carry us instead.
Yeah.
Is that there's always just something that comes, and that's what's meant to come.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to those of you listening, watching, like you aren't missing out on anything. We're gonna put Ash's information. So just kind of get that you have an Instagram account, folks can follow you, and you
Yes.
share
Yep.
lots of beautiful images and your words. There's also your Substack,
Mm,
poetryoutdoors.substack.com. Do you
yes.
want to share a bit about what that is for
Yeah.
folks? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of really been I guess that's really the living embodiment right now of so much of what I've spoken to, a lot of the journey. So a lot of what we shared today is really my story of arriving at Poetry Outdoors. And so Poetry Outdoors is a community devoted to restoring and regenerating our relationship to the natural world through poetry. Through poetry, but also through writing, right? And so that's where I'll be starting to do in the new year. I'll be doing a lot of workshops, a lot of writing workshops that are, not necessarily poetry. I think I like to have I like for my writing workshops to feel accessible for anybody. Because I think that when you put the label of poetry, then people are like, well, I'm not a poet or I'm not a writer. And so like I don't think I belong in this space, right? But I really like to bring in, it's a lot of, bringing in experiences from the natural world. Also giving you assignments of actually getting outside. Is really a lot of like the work that I like to teach, is like getting people outside to have these experiences that we're talking about. Right. And being able to write into them as a way to just like, receive this wisdom that we've spoken to, right? And so I'm going to be doing more teaching in that space. I've just launched a new interview series, so I
Mm,
am
yeah.
doing long form interview like I did in the very beginning days when I was blogging, and so look how things come back full circle.
Yeah.
Interviewing people who are just living in harmony with the natural world and are doing that work of coming back into relationship with restoring and regenerating their own relationships, right? Whether it's to themselves and their work. And then of course I'm sharing my poetry. And so that's a space where you get to kind of read the nature poetry that I've been working on. And yeah, so that's my creative community and my project that I am putting a lot of love into right now. And that's where I would send everybody that's listening today to go and subscribe and check it out.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it so far, by the way. I didn't get to sign up for this last workshop. I'm trying to recall what the topic was. It was a particular
Yeah,
writer, correct? Or
it was so I didn't have any interest come through for that one. And so I was like, oh, interesting. Maybe it's not the right time. So it was we were gonna study the 10 love letters to Mother Earth from Thich Nhat Hanh.
okay.
Um we were gonna kind of explore the relationship with Mother Earth through these letters, which are so beautiful.
Mm,
Um, but that's okay. Like,
mhm,
it just didn't like it wasn't something that people were interested in. And I was like, okay, well, we'll just keep coming back and reiterating. And I think it's like that's what I'm experimenting as this community is growing,
mhm,
right? I'm trying new things and I'm like, getting back into a space of teaching consistently where I haven't in a while. And so there's a lot of things I'm coming back home to that I really missed.
mhm.
And just trusting again that, I will teach that. Um,
Yeah.
I was right.
Yeah, and like I just want to like again just like your voice and like the power that you hold. I did check out your insight timer
Okay.
meditation. So
Yeah.
like I just want like I don't know what you're planning on doing with those, but like that's amazing. And if any I'll probably link that anyways as well.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
I really enjoyed the like the what we call like the life cord, that
Yeah.
cord so there's something I feel like that you're offering with everything that you've been sharing and bringing forth, and like most importantly that's like what we experience in our own learning, and the things that we are like the insights, the contemplations, like that to me is like our job. I feel like that's what we're supposed to be engaging in for our own evolution, but it also does support, like, again, that mirroring of the evolution of all of society.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I'll be linking all these.
Love
You
that you
also
listen
have,
to those. I
oh,
love
yeah,
that
I
you.
was just, there needs to be more. Anyway,
I
sorry.
know.
No
I
pressure.
know. It's like it's interesting, right? And like that's sometimes like I'm getting better at like, I've been somebody that like does a lot of creative things and then doesn't necessarily stay consistent. And I've gotten really good the last couple of years at like discerning like, okay, where do I realistically also just have energy for? Because sometimes I want to do everything,
Yeah,
right? But
I
it's
hear
just like,
that.
but I love that modality. Like I love being able to share like, spoken word poems and meditations the way that I was on Insight, right? So it's just a matter of like weaving in some practices that we've kind of left, right? And bringing them
Yeah.
back in when they're ready to come back too.
Yeah, you got your whole life ahead of you, lady. So
Yeah.
it's all, yeah, sweet. Okay, well, to finally like just kind of close everything off, do you have anything you'd like to share with our listeners? Final
I think
words.
my invitation that I love to give people always is that it's just a simple practice. I think that anybody can take into their own lives is like go for a walk. Go for a walk this week, like whether that's 20 minutes, whether that's an hour. Go to your favorite place in nature, go to your favorite park, walk around your neighborhood, but leave your headphones out. And just see, like, just pay attention to the world in a way that you haven't paid attention before and see what happens, see what shifts inside of you. Um, is an invitation I always like to give to people.
Yeah. Thank you, Ash. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Thanks everyone for listening, watching, and until the next time.
This is a gift. Thank you.